The sensors said it was 340 meters long, harmless, and then every alarm on the Kavesh flagship screamed at once. Not warning tones, not the calibrated chime of proximity alerts. Something deeper, a frequency that bypassed the auditory organs entirely and registered somewhere in the chest, in the marrow, in the triple-jointed hinge of the knee that had no business feeling sound at all. Supreme Admiral Vrenkoss stood at the viewport of the Throne of Ash and watched the small, unremarkable vessel hang in the void, and the number on his tactical display refused to make sense. The mass reading cycled, reset, cycled again, 12 digits, then 15, then a number his instruments had no symbol for, displayed as a string of error characters where a figure should have been. The Kavesh sovereignty had conquered 847 worlds. 12,000 warships filled the orbital space above this pale blue planet, each one 3.7 kilometers of obsidian hull and bioluminescent kill markers, and not one sensor array in the entire armada agreed on what exactly it was looking at. 14 days, that was all it had taken to reach this moment. A calm voice crossed every communication frequency simultaneously, bypassing encryption, bypassing signal range, bypassing the laws of transmission that Koss had relied on for 40 years of unbroken campaign. It arrived not through the bridge speakers but somewhere behind his eyes in his own voice, as though he were remembering words he had never spoken. You were not the first to attempt this. Koss demanded identification. He demanded terms. He demanded anything resembling a coordinate he could orient himself against. His fingers moved to his forearm chitin, the gesture of a commander reaching for the tattoo count that had always told him exactly who he was, a conqueror of 16 systems, victor of the Meridian Scar campaign, the officer who had never once been made to wait. The voice continued, unhurried, unmoved. We outgrew war a long time ago. What you witness is restraint. The small vessel vanished. What came next, the archives would later struggle to name. The part that still keeps the eldest watchers from sleeping, that comes next. Stay close. 14 days earlier, 847 worlds had been drawing breath under chains they had worn so long the metal had begun to feel like skin. Or rather, 14 days earlier, they still knew they were in chains, which is a different thing entirely. The Kavesh sovereignty had a talent refined across 12 centuries for making occupation feel like the natural order. You did not resist the weather. You did not file grievances against gravity. The sovereignty arrived, counted what it found, assigned a resource value, and integrated. The conquered did not call themselves conquered. They called themselves administered. Thorn's Edge was the first to go. A colony system at the outer rim of the galaxy's administrative grid, 3 inhabited worlds, combined population of 900 million. The sovereignty had held it for 200 years. Observer civilization vessels positioned at standard monitoring distance recorded the sequence with the clinical detachment their protocols required. Kavesh standard pattern siege formation, 40 vessels in the front arc, biosphere suppression fields activated in sequence. Then the recordings ended. Not because the observers fled, not because signal was jammed. The recordings simply concluded mid-frame, as though whoever was editing them had decided that the remaining content was not useful. No wreckage, no survivor transmissions, no debris field matching any Kavesh weapon signature in the historical catalog. Thorn's Edge had been there and then it was somewhere else entirely, or perhaps it had decided all at once and without discussion to stop being anywhere at all. The observer vessel that transmitted the incomplete file noted one anomaly in its final automated report before withdrawing to safe distance. The siege formation had not fired a single weapon. Meridian Scar fell 6 days later, Hollow Gate 2 days after that. 3 systems, 2 billion administered lives, were classified as absent. The eldest watchers, those ancient observer civilizations that predate the current galactic order by eons, that have watched every empire rise and dissolve and watched the space where empires used to be convened in private. They reviewed the incomplete recordings. They noted the absence of wreckage. They noted the absence of weapon signatures. They noted the pattern of the endings, the way each recording simply concluded rather than cut, and they said nothing in any chamber that was not sealed 3 times over. The Kavesh sovereignty noted none of this. 1,200 years of unbroken victory creates a particular kind of confidence that is, in practice, almost indistinguishable from blindness. Humanity had been catalogued 600 years prior. The entry was brief, as entries for primitive civilizations tend to be. Observers noted crude fusion drive vessels, planetary confinement, the early stages of what appeared to be standard territorial warfare with no indication of meaningful escalation potential. The assigned classification was Tier 7, monitored, low priority, no engagement recommended. Standard dormancy review scheduled for 200 years hence. 200 years later, the file was opened for review. The observer assigned to the task filed a 1-line addendum and closed the file again. Absent from all records, not extinct, just absent. The distinction mattered to no one at the time. Civilizations went extinct regularly. Civilizations disappeared sometimes too, voluntary withdrawal, species-level migration, transcendence events that left no physical trace. The galaxy had seen all of these. The file was archived under dormancy, inconclusive and forgotten at the bottom of a stack that no one would touch for another 400 years. The sovereignty did not read Tier 7 files before engagements. Why would it? Low-priority worlds did not require research. They required processing. The Armada assembled above the Pacific Basin on the 7th day after Hollow Gate. 12,000 warships. Koss had seen his fleet from outside only once, from the viewport of a shuttle during an inspection circuit, and the sight had struck him with a feeling that was as close to religious awe as his nature permitted. Hull after hull after hull, arranged in the concentric conquest formation that the sovereignty had used unchanged for 8 centuries. Each vessel gleaming with the bioluminescent kill markers that recorded every world brought into administration. So many markers on some of the older ships that the light they produced was visible from planetary surfaces as a second constellation, cold, blue, and rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of victories. The throne of ash sat at the center, 19 kilometers bow to stern. The largest vessel ever constructed under Kavesh engineering doctrine, carrying the Supreme Admiral's staff, the primary siege coordination systems, and, by tradition, the conquest record that would document this engagement and every engagement that followed until the fleet returned to home system. Below them, the planet offered nothing. No fleet emerged from orbit. No communications arrived on any diplomatic frequency. No planetary shield activated, no warning broadcast transmitted. No emergency military mobilization appeared on thermal or gravitational scans. The surface hummed with ordinary civilization, energy signatures consistent with a populated world, city-scale heat blooms, atmospheric chemical markers indicating active industry. Life, clearly, quite a lot of it. Silence entirely. Koss had encountered silence before. Civilizations sometimes went silent when the Armada arrived. It was a grief response, he had been told by the behavioral analysts on his staff. A species-level freeze reflex in the presence of overwhelming force. They always broke eventually. The silence never lasted past the first demonstration strike. Once a population watched a moon disintegrate, the quiet period ended and the negotiation, such as it was, began. He ordered the crew to their pre-conquest meal. It was tradition, and Koss believed in tradition the way engineers believe in load-bearing walls. The meal itself was unremarkable. The same fermented mineral compound the officer corps had eaten before every engagement for as long as the sovereignty had been the sovereignty, sharp and slightly organic. A smell that had become so associated with imminent victory that junior officers occasionally reported smelling it in their sleep before significant battles. Trays were set. The officers ate. Below them, the planet continued its silence. Koss ate half his portion and pushed the rest aside. He was not hungry. He would remember that detail later, in the way that people remember small departures from habit and understand, only afterward, that some part of them already knew. The first strike order went out at 3:40 station time. Annihilation beams, 47 primary emitters on the fleet's forward arc, each capable of vaporizing a planetary shield array in 3.7 seconds. The targeting solution was standard, not even a sophisticated calculation, just the automatic acquisition that the sovereignty's fire systems performed on atmospheric layers, the way a hand performs the opening of a door, a motion so practiced it no longer required thought. Koss watched the beam columns descend through the tactical display with the mild attention he might give to a routine administrative process. They bent. Not deflected. Deflection implied a surface. Not absorbed. Absorption implied a material. The beams curved at the midpoint of their descent as though they had encountered a preference. As though the space between the Armada and the planet had opinions about trajectories and the trajectories had chosen at a certain altitude to honor them. The energy columns curved away from the planet's atmosphere in long, graceful arcs and dissipated into nothing at a distance of approximately 3,000 kilometers from the surface, vanishing so completely that the sensor arrays registered no residual heat signature. Silence on the bridge. Then, the voice of Commander Dirk Orven, Chief Weapons Officer, a 30-year veteran who had personally overseen the bombardment of 11 systems and who Koss had never once seen at a loss for words. Admiral, the targeting data is correct. The systems are operational. I have no explanation for what you just observed. Koss said nothing for 4 seconds. On a bridge that processed commands in fractions of those, 4 seconds was geological time. Again, he said. They fired again. The beams bent again, curved at the same altitude, dispersed at the same distance, left the same absence of residual signature. A third array went active, the secondary emitters designed for atmosphere penetration at steeper angles. Those beams curved too at different points in their trajectories, as though each one was being individually considered and individually declined. The data from this engagement exists in the Deep Void archives, reviewed later by civilizations who spent considerable time and effort trying to understand what the sensor readings were actually measuring. The consensus, reached after much analysis, was that the sensors were measuring accurately and the problem was with physics, not instrumentation. Physics specifically appeared to have developed a position. Humanity had been catalogued as insignificant 600 years prior, Observers noted primitive warfare, crude fusion drives, planetary confinement. Then it had vanished from all records, not extinct, just absent. The Kavesh sovereignty escalated to fighter swarms. 14,000 attack craft, each armed with biosphere sterilization ordnance, deployed from the Armada's carrier vessels in the standard saturation pattern. The launch took 11 minutes. Koss watched the swarm disperse across the tactical display. 14,000 points of movement spreading toward the planet's atmosphere in the concentric rings that sovereignty doctrine had designated as optimal coverage for a Tier 4 surface engagement. And he felt, for the first time in 40 years of command, something in his chest that was not confident. He did not name it. Naming it would have required acknowledging its right to exist. Serac was 22 years old in Kavesh reckoning, which put him somewhere in the range of what other species might call late adolescence. If late adolescence came with a kill count tattoo burned into the forearm chitin that still hadn't finished healing. The edges were raised and heat bright, and when he gripped the flight controls during high-G maneuvers, the pressure on the fresh ink produced a sensation that his instructors had described as an appropriate reminder of commitment, and that Serac privately thought was just pain. He had wanted the tattoo. He had wanted everything about this. His first deployment, his first real engagement, the first mark on his record that would begin the count his father had told him to make the pride of his lineage. His engine died at 47,000 feet. Not a failure, there was no failure alert, no warning cascade, no mechanical irregularity preceding the loss of thrust. The engine simply stopped, the way a conversation stops when everyone in the room simultaneously decides they have nothing left to say. Around him in the half-second it took his senses to register what had happened to his own craft. 13,999 other engines stopped too. The tactical feed froze. Then the feed wasn't frozen, it was accurate. 14,000 craft, mid-descent, engines at zero in freefall. He did not crash. That was the part Serac would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward, sitting in a room on the planet below with no guards and no locks, trying to understand why it felt more frightening than dying would have. He fell. The ocean came up. And then, gently is the only word, gently, the way you might set down something fragile if you were being careful. The water received him, and the craft and all the other craft around him, settling them into the Pacific surface without violence, without damage, the cockpit seals intact, the ordnance inert. 14,000 weapons of biosphere destruction placed in shallow water and empty desert like toys a child had grown tired of and put away. No shots fired. No communication from the surface. The sovereignty's greatest asset, its scale, became meaningless when there was nothing left to measure it against. Back on Throne of Ash, the bridge had gone the kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people with very strong opinions all arrive at the same wordless conclusion simultaneously. Koss stood at his station. Around him, 40 officers who had each participated in the administration of multiple systems, who collectively represented centuries of operational experience, found various small things to focus on. A display, a console readout, the middle distance. Orven spoke first. It was a short sentence, technically a tactical assessment, but the way he said it made it sound like something he was confessing to himself as much as reporting to his commander. Admiral, we have no remaining first strike options. Koss felt his hand move to his forearm. The tattoo count, 16 systems, 40 years. The sovereignty's record stretched back through history as an unbroken argument that certain kinds of power were simply insurmountable. He ordered the emergency protocol review. The analysts began working. The tactical AI began processing. The communications officers opened every frequency. Forwards arrived. Broadcast simultaneously across every channel the sovereignty possessed on every frequency, in a cadence so even and so unhurried that it took the communications team 3 seconds to confirm it was not a system malfunction. Calm, no emotional inflection. Stated once with the particular finality of something that has already been said some time ago in a context that no longer exists, and is being said again now only as a courtesy to the record. We warned you. The Throne of Ash tried to run. That was the first thing the records would note in the sessions afterward when what remained of the galactic community gathered in sealed chambers to process what had occurred. Not that the sovereignty had fought. Not that it had negotiated. That it had tried to run, and that the space around it had simply declined to assist. Navigators on the flagship's bridge worked with the focused desperation of people who understand, on some cellular level, that the math is wrong but cannot stop doing the math. Jump coordinates plotted, replotted, verified against 3 independent navigation systems. All 3 systems agreed. The coordinates were correct. The destination was real. The warp drives engaged with the familiar deep vibration that Koss had felt through the soles of his boots 10,000 times across 40 years of campaign, the sensation that meant the fleet was folding space, that the engagement was over, that Throne of Ash and every vessel behind it was already, in practical terms, somewhere else. The fleet did not move. The drives ran, the vibration continued. Space held the armada where it was the way a hand holds a coin, not with effort, not with visible force, just with the quiet assumption of authority over small things. 3,000 kilometers away, across the emptiness above the Pacific Basin, something began to happen to the outer edges of the formation. 3,200 vessels vanished. Not destroyed, destruction leaves evidence, debris fields, heat signatures. The expanding gas clouds of vaporized hull plating. These ships were simply somewhere else. Sensors swept the surrounding volume and found them drifting 800 light-years beyond known space, their crews alive by all biological indicators, their engines non-functional, their communications returning nothing but the ambient hum of a region of the galaxy they had no charts for and no way back from. Koss received the positional report and read it twice. Then he set it down on his console with the particular care of a person handling something they do not trust themselves to hold correctly. 1,800 ships did not appear anywhere. Their positional transponders went inactive. Crew biometric feeds flatlined then, and this was the detail that the analysts would return to repeatedly in the months following. Then the biometric archives, the historical records of every crew member's medical data stretching back years, simply developed blank fields where the entries had been. Not deleted, not corrupted. Blank in the way that a page is blank when nothing was ever written on it. Personnel who had existed for decades, who had families in other systems, who had service records and tattoo counts and favorite meals, showed as fields that the archive software interpreted as empty rather than cleared. The eldest watchers, monitoring from their designated safe distances, noted this in the kind of silence that is not the absence of speech, but the presence of something too large for speech to approach. Then the temporal effects began. Bridge officers on the remaining vessels began reporting, in communications that grew increasingly fragmented, that something was wrong with sequence. Commands issued and heard before they were given. The order to activate emergency shields arriving in the communications log 4 minutes before the officer issued it. Chronometers on adjacent consoles displaying dates that differed not by seconds or minutes but by centuries, as though the ships occupied multiple positions in time simultaneously and the instruments were faithfully reporting all of them. A cruiser designated Sundering Mark experienced what the recovered data described as complete hull aging. The exterior plating, through the viewports of adjacent vessels, visibly corroding from functional composite to flaking rust, the process taking approximately 11 seconds. The life support systems within it cycling through states of obsolescence and innovation that should have been separated by decades of technological development. The crew of Sundering Mark remained motionless through this. Mid-gesture, mid-breath, mid-step, frozen in a moment that the universe had apparently decided to expand for its own purposes. None of this was loud. Representing the greatest military force assembled in 12 centuries, was being disassembled in ways that physics had not previously scheduled, and the process was quiet. No weapons fire, no impacts, no detonations. The sounds that reached the monitoring vessels were the ordinary sounds of space, which are no sounds at all, and beneath them something that one observer species described in their report as the texture of a decision being carried out. Koss stood at the viewport of Throne of Ash and looked at the space where his fleet had been. Or rather, he looked at what remained, which was shrinking. He was a precise man. 40 years of command had made precision a reflex, and some portion of him was still counting even now. Approximately 6,000 vessels still visible in formation. Then 5,200. The vanishings were not dramatic. Ships were present, and then they were not present, and the formation closed around each absence the way a body closes around a wound. He reached for his communications console. Every channel he opened returned signal. The problem was the content of that signal. His own fleet transmissions broadcasting back to him. Not current transmissions, archived ones from engagements fought 200 years before Koss was born. Voices of commanders whose names appeared in the historical records as early examples of sovereignty tactical doctrine. He heard a dead admiral giving orders to a planet that had been administered for 2 centuries, the signal pristine, the timing completely confident, the outcome already known to everyone except the voice transmitting it. He closed the channel. Commander Orvan was standing at his station. The tactical display in front of him showed a readout that no longer corresponded to any tactical situation for which doctrine had been written. He was looking at it anyway, because looking at a thing is sometimes the only available response to a thing, and Orvan was a man who needed something to look at. Orvan, Koss said. The commander turned. His eyes had the quality of someone who has been awake for long enough that the face has stopped performing. Admiral. That was all. 2 words from a man who had never in Koss's memory used 2 words when 12 would serve. Koss understood from those 2 words that the assessment was already complete and that Orvan had arrived at the same place Koss was standing, and that neither of them had a next sentence. 3 months earlier, a sealed archive in the deep void had contained an entry that predated the Kavesh sovereignty's founding by 400 years. It would not be opened until after this engagement. When it was opened, the analysts who read it would find that it already knew. Not estimated, not projected, knew, in the confident past tense of something recorded after the fact. except that the date on the entry preceded the sovereignty's first conquered world by 4 centuries. The entry described this moment in particular, the 2 officers standing on the bridge, the number of ships remaining, the silence. It described what was about to happen. It described in a single sentence at the end why. But that archive was still sealed. Koss had not read it. He reached up and straightened his uniform. A reflex 40 years deep, the motion of a body that has performed authority so many times it continues the performance after the audience has left. The collar adjusted, the rank insignia aligned. He had done this before 11 system fall ceremonies, before 16 conquest record ceremonies, before every significant moment in a career defined by moments that significant. He did it now on a bridge where every station was dark except Orven's, before an empty viewport and an emptying formation, and an engagement that had not yet supplied him with a name for what it was. On the planet below, a room existed with no locks on the door. Zarak had been sitting in it for 3 hours. He did not know this because the room had no chronometer, but his body had a rough sense of duration and it told him 3 hours, possibly 4. The room was ordinary in a way he found deeply unsettling. Not a cell's cells had a logic, a defined relationship between captive and captor that established what each party was. This room had furniture. A window, something on a surface that might have been food in a shape he didn't recognize. He had not touched it. A human sat down across from him. Zarak had never been this close to a human. Fleet engagement doctrine maintained significant distance between sovereignty personnel and planetary populations until the administration phase was complete. What he had expected from the briefings was something roughly humanoid and militarily negligible. What he found at close range was a person of indeterminate age who looked at him with an expression he could not classify, because the expression contained no fear and no hostility and no superiority, none of the emotional states that defined a relationship between a conqueror's representative and a conquered species. The human looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they have been waiting for and have been prepared to receive. "Are you afraid?" the human asked. The question was simple enough. Zarak considered lying and then considered that lying to something capable of stopping 14,000 engines simultaneously was probably not a meaningful exercise in self-protection. "Yes," he said. The human nodded, a small motion unhurried. "That means you're still here, that's a gift." Zarak opened his mouth to ask what gift means when your entire civilization is above you in orbit being processed by something that hasn't raised its voice once. The human was gone before he could form the sentence. Not fled, simply no longer in the room, in the way that things in this engagement kept ceasing to occupy the space they had previously occupied. Zarak sat with the open question for a long time, turning it over, fitting it against every frame of reference he had, finding it didn't fit any of them. Above him, the last 4,000 vessels of the greatest armada in 12 centuries continued their quiet erasure. The throne of ash received one final sensor contact. A vessel appeared at a range of 340 meters from the flagship's bow, close enough, by standard engagement doctrine, to be inside the dead zone of primary weapons systems. The tactical display registered it as 340 meters in length. Then the mass reading began cycling. 12 digits, 15. A number with no symbol displayed as error characters. The proximity alarms engaged at a frequency that registered in the chest, in the marrow, in the triple-jointed knee. Koss had been to this moment already from one angle. Now he stood inside it from another. The human vessel held its position. No weapons visible, no armor plating, no identifying marks. Space around it moved differently, the void bending and folding at the ship's edges the way light bends near massive objects. Except light near massive objects follows predictable curves, and this was something else. This was space conducting a private negotiation with the vessel's presence and not winning. Koss looked at the mass reading, looked at the error characters where a number should have been, looked at the proximity alarms still registering safe distance and screaming anyway. Somewhere behind him, he heard Orven draw breath and hold it. The tactical analysts had been working since the first strike. 12 hours of the best military minds the sovereignty had trained across 12 centuries of continuous operation, running every known model, checking every catalog entry, cross-referencing every species file. They had concluded 20 minutes prior that the mass readings were not a malfunction. The sensors were measuring accurately. The problem was with physics. "You were not the first to attempt this." The voice arrived in his own voice, behind his eyes, as though he were recalling something he had once decided. Koss had been a military man his entire adult life. The instinct of military life is to demand information, identification, terms, the structure of exchange that defines one party's relationship to another. He demanded all of it. The words came out with the authority of 40 years of command behind them, and they dissipated in the air of the bridge with approximately the same impact as the annihilation beams had made on the planet's atmosphere. His voice sounded to his own ears like the transmission from 2 centuries ago he had heard on the communications channel, completely confident, outcome already determined, just not by the speaker. The human voice continued, one sentence, 12 words. "We outgrew war a long time ago. What you witness is restraint." The human vessel was gone. Throne of Ash ceased to exist, not in the way ships ceased to exist, not in the way that anything the sovereignty's 12 centuries of warfare had made cease to exist. There was no shockwave, no expanding debris field, no final transmission on any frequency. The 19 kilometers of obsidian hull and bioluminescent kill markers and 40 years of command and 12 centuries of unbroken records simply were not present in the space they had occupied. The positional data for every vessel in the formation flatlined simultaneously. The biometric archives developed blank fields. The conquest records, the meticulous documentation of 847 administered worlds, of every system brought into the sovereignty's care, of the 16 systems on Vren Koss's forearm. The records ended mid-sentence, the final entry incomplete, the cursor positioned after the last character as though the scribe had been called away and simply never returned. What the archives could not reconstruct, they later noted, was not merely the fleet. They could not reconstruct the sovereignty itself. Searches for historical records returned incomplete files. Cross-references led to blank fields. Civilizations that had been administered for 2 centuries found that their administration records had developed the same quality as an empty page, not erased, not corrupted, simply absent in the way that things are absent when they were never written. The 847 worlds did not experience liberation, because liberation implies something to be liberated from. They experienced, over the course of a single planetary rotation, the gradual awareness that a weight they had grown so accustomed to carrying that they had stopped noticing it was no longer there. The Kavesh sovereignty had conquered 847 worlds and maintained 12 centuries of unbroken operation. It ceased to exist on a Tuesday. No one had asked the question that was accumulating in every sealed chamber across the galaxy, but the eldest watchers asked it anyway in private with 3 locks on the door, and even then they asked it quietly. If they can rewrite what exists, what else can they erase? What prevents them from rewriting what remembers? No one answered. Everyone already knew. Zarek sat on a coast he had no name for. The Pacific he would learn much later, though the word meant nothing to him for a long time and then meant everything. The water moved in the regular pattern that large bodies of water move on worlds with moons, and the sound of it was the same sound his briefing materials had described as white noise, and it was not. It was specific. It was this water, this coast, this particular afternoon light at an angle his homeworld had never produced, and he was the only Kavesh left anywhere in existence to perceive it, which was a fact so large that he had stopped trying to hold it all at once, and had started simply sitting with the portion of it that fit within the moment he was in. The conquest tattoo on his forearm was fading, or rather, it wasn't fading. The ink was where it had always been. But the archives that the tattoo referenced, the count it was supposed to represent, had developed blank fields, and a record that cannot be located in an archive has a different quality than a record that can. And Sarek had begun to think of the marks on his arm as a sentence in a language that no longer had a dictionary. He watched the water. He did not know if he was being kept or simply had not yet been addressed. The distinction had seemed important when he first arrived on this coast and seemed less important now, the way distances seem less important when you have stopped planning a journey. The room with no locks was behind him up the low hill. Someone had left more food today, in shapes he still didn't recognize, and he had eaten some of it and found that it was not unpleasant. Humanity had not defended itself. The eldest watchers reopened archives noted this in the precise language of civilizations that have been keeping records longer than most species have been having thoughts. The 600-year absence had not been dormancy. The fragmented logs described a species that had spent those 6 centuries learning to step outside the battlefield by rewriting the conditions under which battlefields exist, not building weapons, not constructing defenses. Doing something else entirely, something that the archived logs approached from several angles without quite naming, the way you might describe a color to someone who has never seen it, getting at it from the edges, the ways other things look different when it is present. On Earth, no broadcasts followed. The warning had been given once. Once was all that was required. Above the Pacific Basin, 340,000 kilometers up, the orbital space was empty and ordinary. Starlight passed through it. The planet turned beneath it. The frequencies that the sovereignty had flooded with its presence were quiet now, open, carrying only the ambient transmissions of a civilization that had returned to its regular operations and found them exactly as it had left them. In the deep void archive, the eldest watchers sat with sealed records across their laps and did not open them yet. The water moved on the coast. Zarek watched it and did not look up.